excited to be talking to Marcus Evans today, a psychoanalyst from the UK. I reached out to you because I saw that you and your wife, Susan, had written a book sort of pushing a different narrative than what's commonly accepted with affirmation therapy. But between the time I contacted you and now, there's been this huge press moment where the courts ruled that the UK could not prescribe puberty blockers for children under 16. So if you don't mind, if we could talk about that a little bit and then pivot to your book.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, would it be helpful if I said a bit about my involvement and how I came to be involved and my wife's involvement? Is that all right?
That would be great.
Yeah, okay. So the Tavistock is the National Health Service Psychotherapy Training Centre. And I worked there for about 20 years as part of the management. And I knew a bit about this gender identity disorder service. And my wife worked there in the early 2000s. I didn't work there. I worked in the adult and adolescent department. But basically, she was alarmed by some of the things that were going on way back then. And suffice to say, what happened was she decided to approach the medical director, who started to a report on what was going on in the service. And that was in 2005. Anyway, the culture didn't really change, despite the fact that the then medical director, David Taylor, he basically said that the service was sort of going away from good clinical governance. There wasn't an interest in research, there wasn't enough interest in scrutinising the method, and that, anyway. My wife continues to work there, but not a lot changed. The culture was very much against sort of psychological inquiry. So she left. So then I retired from the Tavistock in 2018, and I took up a role as governor. Now, basically, it's a voluntary role in which you're sort of overseeing the workings of the trust. Are the trust management looking after the kids and the students and everybody who comes to the trust? And there were two things which came into the sort of governor's in tray. One was a letter from a group of parents. They were called the Concerned Parent Group, and they raised similar concerns that my wife had been talking about 15 years ago, namely that their kids who had been treated by the service, they had comorbid problems. Some of them were on the autistic spectrum, some of them are socially isolated, eating disorders, and that the kids didn't get the sort of thorough psychological evaluation that they would believe a national service would, and that's what it is, it's a national service, would provide. Just stop me if you want to interrupt.
No, this is great, because one of the things that those of us who are concerned about this are wondering, how on earth did this happen? Because I don't know if you know my history, but I had gender identity issues when I was a little girl, and was insistent that I was a boy in first grade, was very aggressive about it. And my school psychologist was called in to evaluate me. And of course, they didn't say, you're right, you're a boy, go ahead, use the boys' bathrooms and we'll put you on puberty blockers. They worked really hard to try and help me to manage my dysphoria. And so how did we go from that approach, which seems like a very sane approach, to medicating kids who, you know, in my case, my gender identity issues resulted after a sexual assault. You mentioned autism, you mentioned eating disorders. It's just hard for someone like me to figure out how we went from, you know, what seemed like a very reserved and smart approach to just chaos and experimentation on children.
Well, if I continue the story a bit, some of those things and what I've learned, because I didn't know a lot about the area at all. I work in psychiatry, and that's my first love is psychiatry. But okay, so what then happened? The next thing was this colleague of mine, who's probably the best known clinician in the Tavistock. He's got an international reputation. His name's Dave Bell. And he, before I'd arrived there, he was the staff governor. And 10 members of staff from within the service had approached him with their concerns about the clinical approach. And he'd written a report in which he talked about the fact that a lot of these kids have been traumatized in their families, sometimes outside the family, that there were complicated reasons, for comorbid reasons, that may be leading to them wanting to transition, as you say. Okay, so what's the Trust's response? Well, basically, to cut a long story short, first of all, I asked to see his report. I wasn't allowed as a new governor to see the report. Secondly, they set up they asked the current medical director to write a report. I asked that Dr. Bell be there to listen to the report to see if it dealt with the staff's concerns. That was denied. And basically what I felt was that over time it became apparent that they were trying to bury the problem by using their own report, which was now to be used as a heavyweight tome. We just bury the problem. There's no problem. Now, my view about this is it's a controversial area. There's very little evidence that's of any substantial quality, and that the Trust should welcome the opportunity to open things up and have a think about the downsides of treatment, the outcomes of treatment, long-term research, etc. It didn't do any of that, in my view. And then what happened was the next day they released a notice on the website basically undermining Dave Bell, saying that he didn't have the qualifications to write the report, and saying that these cases were made up cases. And I know Dave Bell well. He's one of the most ethical clinicians I know. And I also, know from talking to staff that this was the Trust once again trying to sort of bury the problem. So I resigned, and because I realised there was no point in talking to the Trust. No one was interested, and you'd signed a confidentiality clause, which meant that effectively I could talk to the Trust about my misgivings, but I couldn't talk to anybody else. So that created quite a stir. I was interviewed many times by various different people, and I suddenly realised that anybody who raised questions about what was going on, was shouted down as being transphobic, and there was an attempt to sort of shut down the discussion, and this got really nasty at times. I was asked to present at the House of Lords. There's a panel of 5 people. In fact, 2 came from America. One's an endocrinologist. The other comes from a group of parents who are concerned. And we presented at the House of Lords. And then the question was what to do next. And it was evident that although I think in a recent survey, 90% of medics in this country, there's more, are very worried about giving young children puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. They're very worried about it. But it only takes a few medics, who don't agree with that approach. There is virtually no long-term research that is reliable. So there are no guidelines. WAPATH, the World Health Authority, and this, is very biased in my opinion. So effectively, the only thing that my wife and I thought we could do is take a judicial review. She took the review, not me. And she coupled up with a woman called Mrs. A, who's got a gender dysphoric kid, who's autistic, and they got the ball rolling. They gathered with the lawyer, Paul Conrath, a team of sort of world experts in autism, in endocrinology, and from some people from the States, Stephen Levine, who's an expert psychiatrist in the States. He put in a witness statement. So it was the professor from Sweden on autism. You know, so it's a sort of world effort. We got clinicians from Australia as well, and it was a substantial piece of evidence that was presented to the court. And you know, as you heard, you know, the judges, and it was 3 judges, and the senior judge is the 3rd highest judge in the land. So the courts were taking it extremely seriously. Basically said that, you know, it would have to be extraordinary circumstances in which children under the age of 16 would be given hormone blockers. And
I believe that they ruled that this is experimental, which those of us who are looking in on it sort of have known for a while. I actually worked for an IRB for a while, and there's no way this kind of experimentation would be approved by a US IRB review panel. And yet it's sort of this unregulated experiment on children, and we have no idea what the long-term outcomes are going to be. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as I say, I'm new to this. Over the last 2 years, I've got involved with it because of my position. And, you know, it's just astonishing, the lack of evidence. There's one long-term study done in Holland 15 years ago on boys, not girls, on an older group than the group that is currently taking hormone blockers. There was something like out of 70 boys, I think there were 20 dropouts, so no one knows what happened to them. So this whole treatment approach is based on one study, you know, and it's not even the same group of kids as is now being treated. So very strange things are going on. The political pressure all the time and interference, I think of it as basically there's a sort of politicization of this whole area, which is pushing out good clinical governance in which you take an interest in research, outcomes, the downside of treatment, follow-up, etc. It's all being pushed out. And there's a move to push gender dysphoria out of psychiatric diagnosis and say it's sort of a consumer choice. The child wants, and then the whole court case was about informed consent. How can an 11-year-old give consent to taking medication which is going to have long-term, unknown, as you say, consequences? Well, I mean, we've got ourselves into a very strange position.
And based on some of the reports that I've seen, clinicians who have been concerned and spoken anonymously to media sources have raised huge concerns that a lot of these children put on this pathway are actually gay and lesbian children who
Exactly.
are experiencing either homophobia from their parents or internalized homophobia.
Yes.
And so we're actually, I mean, it looks to me almost like eugenics against gays and lesbians.
That's definitely true. I think there's a danger in overstating that case. These kids are a mixture. That is a proportion, but you know, they're the kids that, because a lot of parents were contacting Sue and I, and obviously worried about their kids and worried that they're being sort of pulled into not a clinical service that is going to look at them individually, but a sort of set of beliefs that are almost encouraging the transition. And yeah, they're really worried and no longer trust the services to do a thorough job with their kids.
And I saw something you had written, I believe, where you talked about each one of these childs is unique, and to put each one on a pathway without really doing a full psychiatric evaluation is such a disservice.
Well, it's alarming. So I've been in psychiatry for 40 years. In the first 30 years, it was a small number of mainly males transiting to female after the age of 18. And, you know, the claims that then there's a lot of false science which is sort of spread about that claims then that all but 1% of those individuals would make a successful transition. Well, I used to run a parasuicide service in King's College Hospital, in which we would see not vast numbers, but a steady flow of people that, and what happens is, isn't it, they've got complex problems. They believe this is the solution to their difficulty. Everything narrows down. There's a belief this is a magical cure-all treatment. They have the treatment. Then after the operation, they realize they've got the same problems that they had before. Now, some people do make good transitions, but the nut is much higher than 1%, the sort of casualties of this approach. So that was in the adult group. That was 25 years ago. So now what we're facing now is, over the last 10 years, there's been this exponential rise, and the profile is now not 90% male to female, it's 90% almost female to male, and the age range has gone down from 18 and above to 10, 11. Well, this is we don't know what's going on. There's a social phenomena that's involved. There are sort of contagious forces. Then you've got the individual's difficulties, what they're struggling with. No one has got a clue what's going on in this area. What is even more strange is no one seems to be very interested.
Well, and that, to me, as someone who, I love research, I'm kind of a geek. I enjoy reading social science research, sociology and psychology. And it's shocking to me that not only are people not actively trying to figure out what the heck is going on here, that we have this, explosion of girls taking on this identity, but also this running away from doing any kind of research about it and just insisting that this unproven treatment is the only way to address it. And I find that really scary.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, in adolescence, obviously, you're dealing with hormonal changes, you're dealing with the psychological consequences of those changes, and anticipating what society is going to require from you in terms of sexual roles and partnerships and adult life and one thing and another. So there's a whole hodgepodge of things going on. And I think that that one of the problems with adolescence, isn't it, is that with individuals who may feel it's too disturbing in a way, they look for a narrow focus on something that is just going to stop all this confusion. You'll say, this is my problem, this will deal with all my difficulties, this is the route I need to go down. And they want to sort of fix things, in time and stop development, as it were. Now, usually as parents, we sort of understand that, you're sort of a bit tolerant of it. A lot of us didn't enjoy adolescence. We didn't know where we were or what we were doing. But, it's parents and services job to sort of stand by. So that's not too bad. And you experiment with becoming a mod, and then you change to becoming a rocker. And, you experiment with your identities. You're a bit masculine, a bit feminine, And that's the way the development should be allowed to be a little bit confused, allow experimentation and allow development to sort of see its course. And what we're doing is we're sort of fixing something. We're shutting things down, fixing people on a path. As you said, path, it just reminded me, once kids get on the path at 10 and 11, they don't get off. 90% just keep going on the path. So they go, and now what the services claim is the puberty blockers sort of just stop. They put a pause on puberty. Well, you don't have to be an endocrinologist to realize that you can't just switch on and off your endocrinology. It's got its own beat and rhythm. The next thing is there's psychological implications for taking you out of your peer group. You no longer mix with the 13-year-olds. You're sort of on your own, and you know, and so this pathway, it just sort of keeps going. People go from puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then surgical interventions. So,
well, and the thing that, and maybe you can clarify this, but when I hear about puberty blockers, it seems to me like it's inducing a physical developmental delay, but also emotional, psychological, academic delays. And so we're delaying a child who already is too young to consent to medical interventions. And then we're putting them on a path to, you know, cross-sex hormones and surgeries, which are even more invasive and less reversible. And these kids are already delayed. And so they're not at the same point as they would be had they not been on puberty blockers. So it seems to me like they're even less capable of granting consent.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, a lot of the kids that my wife saw back then, and that Dave Bell reports in his report, you know, they've got a lot of difficulties that they're struggling with. And, you know, and one of the expert witnesses, you know, makes the point about the fact that brain development goes on into the mid-20s, and we don't know what we're doing with these puberty blockers. In the first instance, there are concerns about bone marrow development. There are concerns about the effect on, you know, secondary sex characteristics. There are concerns about the effects on the brain. But again, you know, I mean, it's an off-license medication, isn't it? But what is really striking is the lack of the usual appropriate medical caution.
Yeah, to me, that is what is so striking here, is that
Yeah,
it's that parents are being pushed to accept this. I've seen
yeah,
gender I guess I call them transgender advocates, who are telling parents that if they don't allow their child to do this, their child's going to be dead. So they have a choice between a trans child and a dead child. And this to me is just, it's not proven. I've looked at the research and I can find nothing to substantiate these claims.
no.
And I'm so thankful that the courts did a good job of looking into the evidence.
Yeah.
Would you be able to sort of talk a little bit more about what this court verdict means, sort of the implications of it? I've seen a couple of write-ups, and some people are saying, oh, this is amazing, no child will ever get puberty blockers again. Then I've seen more nuanced reports that say, well, actually a child can, they just have to go petition the court. So what do you sort of see as the most important takeaways from the ruling?
Well, I mean, basically, I was a witness in the case, and as I say, my wife started it off, and then handed over to Keira Bell, who I forgot to mention that Keira Bell and Mother A led the court case at the end. Keira Bell was treated at the Tavistock, and after 5 so-called assessments was put on puberty blockers, etc., and stepped forward as the claimant, because basically she felt she'd been let down by services. But yes, I'm not an expert on the ruling, but basically I think that what the judges have done have said there are various bars in order to convince for a clinician to okay them going forward to having medication. There are various different criteria that have got to be met, and the younger the child, the stiffer the criteria. I think basically from 13 to 11, let's put it the wrong way around, 11 to 13, basically it's going to be very difficult for any child to be given puberty blockers. From 13 to 15, again, a pretty stiff test, and then I might be wrong about this, they'd have to apply to a family court where the evidence would be looked at by an impartial judge. And also there are restrictions on the 16 to above age group. But you'd have to sort of look into the ruling. I've been so busy doing various other things. And my wife is the one that sort of led the the Evans part of the court case sort of thing. So,
So do you
but
think this will have implications for cross-sex hormone treatments for children?
yes, no, that I'm not sure about. I mean, I think that I have to say that the service that sort of commissions the Tavistock, it's called NHS England, and once again, I think their oversight of the service's rationale for why they're giving hormones at a younger and younger age. I mean, there's been a lot of slackness in the sort of the contractual oversight, I'll put it like that. Well, now they are really tightening up. I think suddenly, like someone's woken up to the fact that really what's been going on is that the arguments that put forward are sort of, they're to do with human rights and political arguments. They're not clinical arguments. And what's striking about the Tavistock's evidence and our evidence is our evidence was full of clinicians, substantial clinicians with substantial reputations, talking about their experience and their clinical view, and backed up by research. On the Tavistock side, really, it was more like this is what we believe, and this is the sort of, and we want you to believe us. So I think the judges just looked at the comparisons and just said, but these are cultural beliefs. That's not clinical evidence or clinical experience.
Well, and that's
So,
kind of a nice segue, I think, to your book. You have a book out, let me see, it's Gender Dysphoria, a Therapeutic Model for Working with Children, Adolescents, and Young Adults, written with your wife. And I'm assuming that you don't suggest that a child's feelings be affirmed if they believe they're born in the wrong body, without question.
no, I mean, the thing is, we got ourselves into another muddle with the affirmation sort of approach, and we've got something called the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, which basically prohibits clinical staff, in my view, from thoroughly investigating what's going on. That people are worried they're going to be accused of transphobia and maybe reported to the registering body. The thing is that the irony of this is the Tavistock, where I trained, is our national centre for psychotherapy training and family systems therapy training. And you would think it's a place that's ideally placed to look at these kids and what's going on. And so the fact that you've got a service which is going down a very different path, which the Tavistock's got no tradition in, is rather alarming. So basically, yeah, I mean, look, in terms of a psychotherapeutic approach, the approach that my wife and I would take is, people come to you with their beliefs, and it's neither your job to agree or disagree. Your job is to think, well, what's this belief based on? See, where's it come from? Why is it so firmly adhered to? See, one of the things that gets talked about quite a lot is the child was really certain.
Yeah.
Well, certainty is not always a healthy state of mind. One's got to have doubts and questions and look at the conflicts, the downside. See, and this peculiar state where you say, well, they had no anxiety about the decision. Well, you're making a serious, commitment here. And what if you're wrong? So what they would put forward as evidence of the correctness of their approach, I would say is deeply worrying. So basically, you're there to think, okay, who is this child? What are they all about? What are they struggling with? What's going on in their family? And why are they so fixed on the idea that basically they're in the wrong, sex, basically? Why is the vulnerable child who's been abused or mistreated or whatever girl, think that changing from Janet to John is going to solve all their problems. You can't get rid of Janet. You can't just, sort of get rid of her and become something different. The mind doesn't work like that. So that we need to sort of explore and understand, well, what was wrong with Janet?
Right. Well, and that's one of the things that I think about. You mentioned the therapy bands now, and that's how I actually got involved in this, because I realized that the therapy bands that are being proposed would have prevented my school psychologist from helping me to manage my feelings of distress.
Yeah.
And that just shocked me, because what that would have done is that instead the affirmation model would have affirmed the idea that I was inherently flawed, affirmed all that shame and self-hatred that I had, and put me on a pathway that would ultimately lead to self-harming behaviors, and potentially long-term life-altering complications. And to me, that's astonishing that a therapeutic approach would push a child towards something that is that harming, versus trying to sort of eke out what it is that's causing these anxieties in the first place.
As I said earlier, I'm used to people coming to me and say, that they've narrowed down this problem to one idea. There's one problem and one solution, and I'm sympathetic with that, but I'm also there to say, look, we're complicated. We have many different moving parts, and they all interact, sometimes not very coherently. And it's very rarely the case that sort of nailing your colours to one particular mast is going to solve your difficulties. It's usually a matter of trying to open things out and not get so narrowly preoccupied. I mean, this whole preoccupation with gender, it's as if people aren't sort of people with all the problems of being alive, a complicated life. We've got to go through various different challenges and one thing and another. So your job as the therapist is to understand the belief structure of the person presenting, and then say, well, let's take some time to examine and think about you as a person with all your complexity, and understand what's being buried by this belief system. And that there should be a substantial, and the kids come, they're not all of them, but some of them are very fixed. They get very angry because they feel that you're interfering with their solution. Sometimes the family are very fixed. You're looked upon as the enemy if you have a sort of curious, exploratory sort of stance. So one needs some experience, and one needs to avoid getting into unnecessary battles, but sort of doggedly say, my job is to think about not the short-term goal, but the long-term goal, what this is going to do to you. And let's be really sure we understand what this is all about at a deeper level. Once you've gone through a period of prolonged therapy, I wouldn't be for under 18s, embarking on transition, but once people have gone through long with therapy and it's been explored, for some people, this is their best way of living a life. I'm not against transition across the board in any circumstances. I'm not. It's not for me as a psychoanalyst to tell other people how they should live their lives, but 40 years in psychiatry tells me that you've got to help people explore things, examine them, as you've said, and that sometimes think about what's driving their particular belief system and conviction. Why can't they tolerate some confusion and anxiety? We live in a world where we have to come to terms with the fact that we don't always like ourselves, we're frustrated at ourselves. We've got to get by in life, warts and all. psychologically.
I really do worry about these kids who, you know, they come in and they are able to dictate their treatment. They're able to dictate how the adults in their lives treat them. And they seem really fragile to me because they get hurt so easily if somebody misgenders them or uses their dead name. And to me, our goal as adults is to help children grow up to be strong and resilient. And it seems like we're doing just the opposite.
I 100% agree. I think there's an underlying fragility which is masked by this certainty and forthrightness. You know, this is the solution, and it conceals this fragility. And you know, none of us, depends on our characteristics, but none of us like our fragility. You know, but it's part of being human. You know, we can't control everything. We do get anxious about things, quite rightly. We get depressed, we get miserable, sometimes we get a bit manic, you know, but all of those things, well, you've got to sort of, in some ways, embrace and come to terms with, rather than try and get rid of. And I think a lot of the ideas about transitioning is getting rid of something.
And there is a huge difference in my mind between someone who's, say, 30 years old, who's gone through puberty, who continues to have feelings of extreme distress, trying an experimental treatment and seeing if it works, versus a 10, 11, 12-year-old. In the US, we even have 8-year-olds who are being put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. We have 13-year-olds getting double mastectomies and 15-year-olds getting castrated. And to me, there's just a world of difference because, as you mentioned, children's brain development isn't completed until they're in their, you know, early mid-20s. And with these injection of these drugs, you know, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, who knows what that's doing to their ability to analyze their situation and make good choices.
Look, and the thing is one of the things you write about in the book is that it's not the only, that I think the underlying fragility is very important, but then puberty hits. And puberty, basically, for a lot of kids, it's like your body's suddenly out of control, you know, and then you've got this thing looming called sex. I mean, you know, my sons, when, you know, we got called by the school, he'd run out of a sex education thing. He was about 8 years old, and he just said, I shouldn't have to watch that. Someone's going to get hurt. You know, it's really disturbing. And, you know, if you'd have talked to him as an 8-year-old about he's going to have a sexual life and have a baby, he'd be horrified. You know, he'd go, I don't want to know anything about that. So there's often a wish to sort of just put a lid on sexual development. You know, it's a big threat, and it involves a huge change from being your parents' child to being an adult with a sexual life. You know, and we all understand these anxieties. We all went through adolescence, you know, and all this awkwardness and one thing and another. But again, you know, it's like a crisis of in belief in the parental generation that say, well, yeah, but that's okay. It's all right to be a bit disturbed. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. You don't have to know who you are and be completely certain at the age of 13. You can be.
It would be very strange.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think sometimes we don't give them the message that even, you know, in my mature years, I still don't know. I still have doubts. My identity's evolving all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you were talking about that change, one of the things that occurred to me is that especially children who are anxious or have autism or OCD, those are kids who don't handle change well. And so it's not surprising to me that these are kids who would, you know, want to like take control by claiming this identity and by using drugs that would allow them to control their trajectory of their development.
100%. I think, you know, I think the body's feels like it's out of control. I think they want to put a lid on their minds as well, because, you know, the hormonal changes and the emotional consequences of their developing body, which has got implications for their social position. You know, yeah, kids who are fragile and don't deal well with confusing and conflictual emotions just want to put a lid on the whole thing.
And as adults, we need to be walking them through that, not allowing them to tamp it down, because eventually they're going to have to deal with this stuff.
Absolutely, 100%. So basically, to mention the book, it doesn't it doesn't come out for a bit.
Yeah, I was curious if you're going to get much pushback from it.
I'm sure we will. I mean, we're both. I was a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I'm a psychoanalyst, and we're writing from a particular point of view. It's not the only point of view, and others will have different approaches. But basically, we're saying that some of the underlying psychological conflict structures need to be examined, and there's a real vacuum at the moment because of the reliance on medication and affirmation. Basically, we've got a psychological problem which is being treated medically, as if the problem moves from the mind, which can't cope with the turbulence, to fixing the body. But we're needing to concentrate on developing models and services that help kids with what's going on within their minds and within their families, because often the families are very influential, not always, but sometimes.
Well, I'm really grateful that you and your wife have taken this on, because I've talked to a number of mental health practitioners who would like to speak out about these issues, but they won't, because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid of the pushback they're going to get. So I really appreciate what you and your wife are doing.
Well, the thing is, what you realise is, as you say, there's lots of people who are very worried about what's going on, but there's a lot at stake, especially for younger clinicians. You can really be on the wrong side of this argument, and in a way, that's why I decided to resign. That's why my wife took on the case, because the fact is that I don't work in the NHS any longer. My reputation seems to be intact, and my wife's, and maybe it takes the older generation. Got to sort of say, well, it's not that it's been easy. It hasn't been easy, and we do get mud thrown at us. I've been called an alt-right Christian. I don't think I've ever voted right-wing in my life. And the last time I went to church was when I was about 11 years old in boarding school, and I had to go. So how someone musters up that I'm an alt-right Christian, I have absolutely no idea. But people just invent it and then chuck it at you, and hope that some of it sticks, I guess.
Well, and that seems to be how they've actually been able to push this narrative so well, as they've really intimidated people. They have, anybody who speaks out about it is called a hater or a bigot or a Nazi or an alt-right Christian. Pick your slur, basically. And so is there anything else that you would like to tell us about your book?
Well, I was just going to say, there's a political journalist called James Kirkup, who said he's never known a minority group get hold of the political agenda in 30 years of political journalism. He said they've been very effective. No, the book is a psychoanalytic approach. It's aimed at clinicians. I hope we've written it in plain English. There's no attempt to be, write it in sort of fancy technical terms. And basically looking at our view of the psychological forces that are underpinning gender dysphoria, and how one might, how we have gone about working with these kids. And, I hope that amongst other things that come forward, it's a contribution to, because the clinicians, are often feel very guilty because they don't feel they're doing what they should be doing, but they don't really know what to make of the fixed nature of the kids. Now we also see kids who are not fixed. They come as fixed, and actually they want to talk about this, they want to talk about that, and they're not really so sure that they want to transition. Some of the kids at the Tavistock are much more further along a sort of a road in which they're saying that this is what I want to happen. And for clinicians, particularly in the political environment where they're worried they won't get backed, it's hard for them to stand the ground and say, well, hang on, let's have a think about this. And what about this, and what about that? And what, what's the influence of your family? Because if they're not going to be supported by the management, it's very difficult to hold the line. Anyway, this is a model.
In some ways, I kind of look at this and think, we have, let's put our brakes on and let's really do some interesting research, because, when there's this kind of explosion in a mental health issue, that's an indication that something's going on. And I've heard people say, no, there have always been this many trans people. They're just now more comfortable coming out about it. Can you just touch on that for a sec?
There is, as we know at the moment, there's a plethora of bogus claims, which, as you said, are completely unsubstantiated. You gave your own example. We know a psychotherapist called Stella O'Malley. She talks about being absolutely sure she was a boy. And, I think Ken Zucker who was the serious researcher, who got shut down because of accusations that he was transphobic. And basically, I think it was him, I'm not sure, his research basically said that, if you do watchful waiting, which was the old approach before affirmation, for which there is an evidence base, basically 90% of these kids desist,
Which is, I think, the good outcome. And that's something that I hear, that we're trying to push them to be, heteronormative or gender normative or whatever. But to me, what I'm thinking is it's healthy, that if, it's going to be more healthy in the long run for a child not to be put on drugs and hormones and get surgery. I actually have a friend who went through the full surgery, sex change, realized it was a mistake. And for the rest of his life now, he has to get testosterone injections because his gonads were removed. And so it's not about, pushing some sort of normativity on these kids. It's about health for me.
Well, I don't see a patient and think, well, they have to become a version of what Marcus Evans thinks they should be. That's not my job.
Yeah.
My job is to help understand the forces that drive them, so they can make decisions about what they do in their life. Having said that, because of the age of the kids coming forward, one's got to be really cautious about doing anything which is irreversible, which these medications are. So, I've forgotten your question. Actually, I've got to carry my answer.
I think I was initially thinking about the research opportunities.
Oh yeah, and you also mentioned about the consequences of the treatment. Yeah, it is not easy being trans, whether you talk about the stigma, whether you talk about the way that they are treated, whether you talk about the medical interventions. This is not a sort of magical solution. It's a complicated path that they're choosing, and yeah, absolutely. There's a big downside to it, and a lot of losses that are involved. But
it's interesting for me, when I was, I absolutely did not want children. Even in high school, I asked my doctor to tie my tubes because I was absolutely sure, I didn't want children. And really the body dysmorphia that I had, just that intense hatred of myself and dislike of my body, really the first time I ever felt happy about who I was when I gave birth to my daughter. And they put her in my arms and I was like, this body is okay. And it's huge. And I never would have had that if I had been put down this other path.
100%. No, exactly. Yeah, which 12-year-old thinks they want to be doing what adults do, and
they don't have any sense of what they're going to want when they're in their 20s or 30s. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to mention?
I got sidetracked. I should have said that Keira Bell came in, and I forgot to mention it. You know, I got sidetracked. I was talking about something else. But actually, you know, it was a very important move, because obviously my wife had the clinical experience and knew the research, and she and the lawyer gathered a lot of the expert witnesses. So the sort of foundations of the case were built. And then it's actually for financial reasons, because in this country they've stopped legal aid. So basically, if you go to court and you lose, you end up having to pay the damages.
Oh, wow.
You have to pay the other side's costs as well as your own side's costs.
Right.
So it got a bit hairy. So basically, Keira Bell stepped forward very courageously, you know, and as somebody who's, if we could put it this way, a victim of the treatment, basically, you know, she was the perfect person, and she's been brilliant when she's been interviewed, because she talks with great authenticity about what she went through and how let down she was by services. So, you know, my wife and Keira Bell dovetailed, you know, as a team very, very, very well. The other thing was, he had a fantastic legal team. They were really good.
Well, the fact that you were even able to bring in these international experts is so important. And that's one of the things that I'm frustrated about in the US, is that these cases are so expensive. It's so hard to launch them. And people really are, you know, up against, you know, big pharma. They're up against, you know, these interest groups that have so much money. And so, you know, the precedent set in the UK is going to be really important. All over the world. Well, I really appreciate what you're doing, what your wife is doing, and the other people who helped Keira Bell. Is this Susan?
Is that Erin?
We just were talking briefly about the legal fund for Keira Bell and all that she did. And I was wondering if you could tell viewers how they can contribute to it.
Right, Erin, you've caught me off guard, because I haven't got it completely in my head. But I've got a Twitter account. I'm on Twitter. When I first started the case with Mrs. A, and before Keira courageously joined us in the case. So my Twitter account, there is a link at Sue Evans Protect.
Okay, and I'll put a link to that in the description of the video, so that people, and this money goes to supporting Keira.
So it might be a bit confusing for people, but because I had to start it off, it kind of looks like it's me, but actually if you have a look at the Crowd Justice page, it is the fund for Mrs. A, who was the mother of the daughter, and Keira Bell. And you know, in case we need to continue fighting because the Tavistock may appeal, we would be really grateful, because we're nowhere near our target yet, and it will help continue if we need to, but anyway, she's done a fantastic job, so if anyone can support her, that would be great, and I'll send you the link.
Super, and I really appreciate that. Now I hope that you and Marcus get some sleep and some food and celebrate your victory, and thank you for helping these kids.